Well, hello to everyone who has joined us for our very first ever Living Your Best Life webinar. This is, of course, presented by the Huntsman World Senior Games. And this will be our first in what will be a monthly series where we're going to cover a wide variety of different topics all about living your best life. We want to give a shout out to those who have joined us. And if you wouldn't mind, take just a second in the chat box and type in where you're joining us from, a city, a state, a country. But down at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a little chat button there. If you'll click on that and let us know. Those are starting to come in now. We've got guests joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, from Charleston, West Virginia. We've got some people from Utah. We've got guests joining us from Rexburg, Idaho, Logan, Utah, Coronado, California. So we're coming in from all over the place. And once again, we welcome you. We're glad that you can join us, and we're looking forward to sharing some fun and exciting, and we think what will be useful information for you, especially as we start off a brand new year in 2021. And yeah, we're just excited about it. So we've got people joining us from Grand Prairie, Alberta, Canada, really from all around the world. So to welcome to you, before we jump into our expert presentation and our expert presenter, which we're going to do here in just a moment, I want to cover just one important thing as we go along. And if you have questions about the content that we're covering, once again, down at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A button. Go ahead and type in your question there, and then we're going to do our very best to answer those questions. Some of them we'll answer at the end of the presentation. But as we're going along, if you have a question, pop it right there in the Q&A button box there, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We may not cover them all, but we want to get to as many as we possibly can. So now on to our expert presenter. We're so excited to have James Garrett joining us today. James is a brain hacker. He's a brain coach. He is the founder of Brain by Design. He's spoken on stages ranging from Harvard to TEDx, and his work has been featured in the New York Times as well as Fast Company and Harvard Business Review. He's trained thousands of Arab youth in partnership with Her Majesty Queen Rania of Jordan. James is truly, and this is true, he's a rare combination of scientist, trainer, and entrepreneur. In 2019, James launched the Deep Change Project, which is a brain hacking journey to discover what's possible at the outer edges of neuroplasticity and the science of human potential. So James, welcome.
Thanks, Kyle. So grateful to be here.
Well, we're just excited to have you here with us, and especially as we kick off this webinar series. And like I said, we're starting a brand new year, and there's, let's be honest, the year that we just left behind might have brought a little anxiety with it as we're confronting 2021. But let me just say this. We're going to get into a few questions here, and we really want to learn from you and your expertise. But one of the things, James, that I most admire about you and the way that you approach your work is your willingness to do so much more than talk the talk. Ladies and gentlemen, seriously, James Garrett does not just do some research and then publish papers. Like, he immerses himself into these concepts. We talked about the Deep Change Project, and I have followed that along as you've kind of gone through some of those experiences and things that you've put yourself through, not just told other people how to do it, but put yourself through. And we're talking today about facing fears. I know that you have been very open and very candid about some of your fears. And then you've just jumped right into ways that you've determined that you can overcome some of those fears. So when we're talking about this subject, I want you all to know that again, James is not just a guy who reads some papers and then synthesizes that into another paper. He is really out there doing it. And I found that inspirational as well as entertaining. I won't lie, there have been a number of the videos that I've watched that are entertaining. But let me ask you this, how did you start this deep change project, because that relates so much to facing fears.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate that. Um, to be honest, one of the things that really propelled me to kind of take this next step as I don't even know what to call myself. Sometimes I call myself a brain hacker, right? Right. But
Right.
to really be doing the experimentation in my own life was realizing that I was really good at hiding behind the science.
Yeah.
So I spent the last about 2 decades really diving into brain science psychology. Of course, I studied that, did a lot of research in that. Most of my 20s I spent in research labs, um, studying with amazing psychologists in New York and Boston. And my takeaway from all those years in science, and then most of my 30s were in the Middle East, as you mentioned,
Right.
trying to build programs and content and curricula to create transformational experiences using some of this, brain and behavioral science to positively impact the world. And then I sort of realized, well, there's these different ways to relate to this kind of stuff, and one way is to read and get it. You like understand it up here, right?
And that's
Which
a
is
valid way.
valid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, and another way is to try to, I guess, teach it. I've never quite framed it this way, but it was to really teach it, as we were doing there. And then there's living it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of realized, man, I don't necessarily know if I'm being as open and clear and sort of honest and transparent as maybe authentic as maybe I could be. And so I embarked on the Deep Change Project beginning of 2019 with the goal of really kind of making as transparent as possible my own change process.
Yeah.
Um, and what change looks like when you're trying to change yourself, something that scientists call self-directed neuroplasticity, this gigantic word, right? Or two words. Um, it, 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 it's both a journey that's full of all this kind of like interesting tidbits around the science, but it's also this kind of art. And you can think of it like I've been doing this giant experiment on a single person, namely myself, right?
Right.
Where I'm trying to literally rewire my brain in very particular ways and change myself for the better. The reason I call it a deep change project is because there's this really interesting line of research from Richie Davidson and others who've shown that we can not only just change our states, being happier, being more mellow or calmer through meditation or something like that.
Sure.
We can do those kinds of things, but the more interesting, I think, argument is that we can change our traits.
Mm.
So not just changing states, but changing traits. And so for me, I was like, well, who would I want to be if I could actually design who I am in the world? Like if I could kind of like redo this whole thing or something, right? Or sort of start with a blank slate, like who would I actually want to become or be in the world? What types of traits inspire me? Um, and some of those I thought maybe I was doing okay on, and others I was like, oh, I'm not doing so good on those. So
Start making the list, right?
start making that list. There's obviously lots of historical examples of this, like Benjamin Franklin and others who sort of took this pretty seriously. But what I think is interesting in 2021 is we have better tools to both track, measure, and more importantly, affect our own change processes. And I think both science and technology kind of work together to give us deeper insights into the changes we're actually making. But more importantly, the most important thing I think is getting as good at the skill set of change or behavior change.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. Um, and I want to get into some of those steps and ideas and discoveries that you have made not only in the research, but through your own personal experience. But let's back up maybe one step and define a few of these terms. We've mentioned neuroplasticity a couple of times.
Yeah.
For people who are not familiar with what that means, define for us what neuroplasticity is.
It's a terrible word, isn't it?
It's a big word, right? It's a big word.
It originally was coined by William James. And back in that time, which is around the turn of the previous century, 1900 or so, plastic was a new material.
Okay.
And so when people saw the way plastic could basically be reshaped into anything, it was the changeability of plastic that kind of that was the big technology, was plastic, at that time. And so when that term was coined, the neuroplasticity actually means brain change. So the reason I don't love the word is because we tend to think of plastic as some kind of hard substance, right?
Right.
But what the intention of the meaning behind that word is actually malleability or changeability. So it's really what we're talking about is the science of how brains change.
And again, that's really been your expertise, and you've talked about having dug into that for the past couple of decades. We're talking today a little bit about how to face your fears and how to overcome some of those anxieties and the things that we all face, and independent of all the internet memes about 2020 and all the new ones coming out about 2021. Life can create anxiety. It can be a scary place. There's plenty of things that can be worrisome. Let's dig into that just a little bit. How do we face our fears and more importantly, that the end result is that we overcome them and are able to live a more productive, happy, healthy life because we're not, curled up in this anxiety ball that's whether it's in our mind or physical, whatever that is. How do we go about it? What's the first step?
Maybe the best place to start here is sort of what's the function of fear and anxiety? Why do they exist? Like what good are they? Because they're sure not very fun to feel, right?
Right.
So fear, Joseph Ledoux, who's the world's foremost expert on the amygdala. And the amygdala are these sort of almond-shaped structures. You have two of them on both sides of your brain. They're kind of inside deep in the temporal lobe. They're the alarm centers of the brain. So they're like that annoying kid in middle school who would pull the fire alarm,
Right.
even though there's no fire. So our anxiety centers, unfortunately, are a bit like that. So whether there's a real threat or not, your brain is less concerned. Your brain is more likely to pull it anyway, just in case.
Okay. And that makes sense.
So amygdala are very sensitive to threat or the detection of threat or danger or something bad happening. And again, this isn't just physical threats. Not like somebody coming at you with a fist, right? That's obviously one form of threat, but it could be, I can't pay my rent at the end of the month, or I'm not sure how I'm going to pay my rent at the end of the month. Or it could be like a supervisor or boss who you're about to go into a meeting and they're going to kind of give you some quarterly evaluation. That's very threatening.
It's scary, right? Yeah.
It's very scary.
Relate with that. Absolutely.
Right. So in fact, most of the things we deal with in 2021 are what I would call like psychological threats instead of physical threats, or psychological dangers instead of physical dangers. But your body's basically responding the same way, which is with the stress system. So as soon as you perceive that there's danger, something bad may happen, you're going to mount a stress response. Your body is going to mount a stress response. And the reason it's going to do that is because it thinks that's the best way to help you.
Right.
Here's what actually happens. And to be clear, anxiety and fear both involve the stress system. So so anxiety and fear are actually the same emotion with one subtle difference. Fear is present focused. Anxiety is future focused.
Okay.
Physiologically, it looks identical in the body. So anxiety is I'm worried about something that might happen out there in the future. Fear is like there's someone coming at me with their fist right now.
Right now.
It's imminent, right? That's the only difference. So anxiety actually is fear. Now, the thing to understand about what happens is your body mounts this stress response, and what happens instantly. And Joseph Ledoux, this researcher at NYU, I've described it, will show this, has shown this, which is it has a 3-tiered response, or a sequenced response to a fear or anxiety feeling. We've all heard of fight or flight, right?
Right. Very familiar with that one. We've all learned about that one.
Right. So it's actually fight, flight, or freeze. There's actually 3 things. We tend to drop off freeze for whatever reason. But what's interesting is they actually happen usually in reverse order. So we actually freeze first. We don't fight first. We freeze first. We flee if we can, and we fight if we must.
If we have to, right?
Fighting is always the last option because it's the most dangerous option, and your brain knows this. So the first response to any anxiety you're having in your life, to any worries, is to clam up, to stop taking action, to hunker down, to circle the wagons,
Sure.
to literally like stop taking action. Now, that's great if you're out in the wild and there's an actual real predator. I'm thinking of that cougar video.
Right. I think many of us
Canyon.
That one.
That they actually miss you. The predator doesn't see you because you're so frozen, right? That's actually the biological reason for why we freeze. But if you're trying to pay your rent at the end of the month and you're freezing, meaning you've got 2 weeks left or a week left, and you really do need to you're a small business owner and you really do need to bring in some extra revenue, freezing is the exact opposite of what you actually need to do.
Right.
If you freeze, then you will bring about that feared thing that you're worrying about. So it's an unhelpful response. It's an understandable response, but quite unhelpful, usually in a modern context. So how do you overcome that? I think of fear as a 1.0 system. It's like a default emotional system that, again, it has its function and has its role. If you're stepping out in the street and you hear a car and you have a little fear flush, that's going to freeze you and you're not going to get hit by the car. That's a good thing, right? We need fear in certain situations, but most of the situations where fear freezes us, it's actually unhelpful to us. So that's a 1.0 system. And what you want to do using this kind of science of brain change, your ability to change your brain, is you want to start overriding that freeze response and take action in the face of fear. So what this starts looking like is, if I feel fear, then I take action, again, instead of freezing. So this is like a 2.0 upgrade. It's like you're rewiring your own brain to take action. It's not the default. That's not what happens naturally. It's a rewiring of your own system such that anxiety or fear get you to actually take forward action in your life as opposed to run away and retreat.
Get it. I get it. So that's the neuroplasticity that we're talking about. You're rewiring, you're changing your brain to a more appropriate response to what's going on around you.
You got it.
Awesome. Love it. So we understand what fear is. We understand that there are fear and anxiety are the same thing, which is important, I think, to recognize and understand. We also understand that there is a physiological purpose for fear. It can be life-saving, certainly. But like you said, James, much of the confrontation that we face in our lives in 2021 and certainly in the time that we live in, not all of it, certainly where there's physical dangers around us, but much of it is more in our head than in our external environment. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
But our body's responding the same way no matter what. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I've heard and even in conversations that you and I have had, James, as your body responds over and over and over to these stimuli, that were kind of evolved to help us get away from a saber-toothed tiger, and there are no saber-toothed tigers around us, like that kind of messes with us as well, right? Like that fight or flight or freeze response over and over and over when there really isn't a physical release of those hormones or that, that experience that you're having, right? That kind of messes with us as well, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's important to understand what happens in that stress response. So the first thing to go offline when you have a fight or flight response, right, is this part of your brain behind your forehead. So that's planning, problem solving, logical thinking, working memory.
You don't need any of those things in your daily life,
Literally,
right?
the CEO of your brain leaves the building. The decision making. So the part they call them executive functions. As soon as that stress comes on, they're out. They literally go offline. Yeah. So if you've ever been late and trying to get out the door, you'll know what I'm talking about. And you forget you keep forgetting things. You get in the car and you're like, oh my gosh, where are my keys?
Right.
And you run back in and get your keys and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot the coats for the kids or whatever it is. That kind of harried experience, it feels like a bit like your brain's in a blender. It's because this part of your brain is literally offline. Basically, what happens is the blood that fuels this part of the brain goes out of the brain and into the muscles, especially your leg muscles, to physically, to prepare you to run away if need be. Yeah. So again, you just need to get in the car. You don't actually need to run away, but it's a real problem. Stress is it's like a misfit for the types of problems we have.
Yeah. And yet here we are in 2021 dealing with this, right? So understanding, I think, is a big part of the battle, certainly. But what's the next step? Now that we feel like we have kind of a basic understanding of what's neurologically and physically happening, what now? What's the next step?
The next step is really trying to retrain your brain. So I think of this as strengthening the calming system of the body. So one way you might think of this is like, I want to get a so the calming system, these words, I swear, if I could just rename all of the biological words, it's called your parasympathetic system, right? Okay. The calming system. So the sympathetic system, which is, again, like I think these words are a little confusing. The sympathetic is the elevation system. That's the stress system. The calming system is the parasympathetic system that calms you back down. Okay. So you have a whole system in your body whose whole job it is to pull you back down to normal, back down from that elevated stress state. And you can strengthen that system. It's not like, it's not just something you have. It's not something you're born with. It's something like your bicep that if you exercise it again and again and again, it actually gets stronger. And in fact, one of the most interesting pieces of research is that people who meditate a lot, what the research finds is that they still get angry. But what's interesting is they just don't stay angry nearly as long as the rest of us.
Okay, that's interesting.
So what happens is they have these emotional spikes, like anger and anxiety are very hot emotions. So you have the spike, but then they just bounce back down to baseline within a couple minutes. The rest of us, instead of a couple hours,
we're going to hold on to this, and we're going to worry about it and stress about it, and whatever is going on in our hearts and minds, right?
That's right. So they have something like what I would consider stress resilience. They're able to bounce back from stress quite quickly, and the obstacles and things that kind of get in their way during the day aren't nearly as they don't throw off their day nearly as much as maybe they do with other people. Now that's a product of training their own minds and bodies to strengthen that calming system. So meditation is not just a mental thing, it's also a breathing thing. And specifically, when you're breathing out slower than you breathe in, which is what meditation, if you could boil down what is the physical part of meditation, it's breathing out twice as slow as you breathe in.
Okay.
So you breathe in for 3, breathe out for 6. Or sometimes I like the visual of breathing in through your nose and breathe out through a straw. So just purse your lips, and that will slow down that out breath. That activates the calming system in the body and re-engages that calming system. So somebody cuts you off in traffic. If you start breathing out slowly, it's going to get you back down to feeling like yourself again quite quickly, even though it was upsetting what happened. And it's not just, again, in the moment. If you do this enough times, enough days in a row, you make a habit of this, it's like you get a parasympathetic six pack. It's like the only way I can think of saying that. You literally strengthen that parasympathetic calming system. And so life hits you sideways and you're able to keep your cool. Or even if you do get upset, you're able to recover quite a bit more quickly.
I like that concept on so many levels, not the least of which many of our friends who are attending today are athletes or connected to sports in some way. And I think we all recognize within that community the importance of practice. You know, you want to get better at softball, you've got to practice softball. You want to get better at tennis, you've got to play tennis. And certainly there's room for cross training and other things right there. But I think we all understand that idea of practice. I think it's less better understood the mental aspect of it. I think we all get the physical part of it. But this idea of being able to practice and train yourself to react, I guess not react, but lower your reaction quicker, I think is something that could resonate. And I think that makes sense. So you're talking about meditation, you're talking about breathing. Those are, some tips and techniques, I guess, that we could immediately put into practice. Are there, you've talked about the breathing aspect of it. And like you said, it breaks down to simply breathe in faster than you breathe out. What other techniques are there that we should know about that we could put into practice?
Yeah, there's quite a few, so I don't want to overwhelm. So given I know this group is active and cares about physical activity. Turns out that one of the very best ways to strengthen the calming system or burn off some of that free floating anxiety is exercise. So one of the very best ways to basically think about this: when your body and brain activate a stress response, your body wants you to go for a run.
Yeah.
So if you're worried about the rent and you're feeling stressed about that, one of the most appropriate ways to neutralize that worried, anxious, fearful state is to actually go for a run. Those seem to have nothing to do with each other. It seems like what I need to do is think about it more, and I need to I need to worry about it.
Yes.
And that's going to somehow fix the problem. Well, actually, the better thing is I'm just going to put on my running shoes and get out the door, go for a quick, walk or run, get outside, calm my whole system down, and then come back to the problem and have a clear head again. So free floating anxiety, a lot of these things end up being what end up, the symptoms of them end up being like worry thoughts or worry patterns, worry loops. But the cause of them often is bodily or bio. It's a deep, you can solve a mental problem with a body solution, which is moving and being physically active.
Two great tips. The breathing, the meditation, the exercise. I think that makes a lot of sense. If anyone has just joined us or has joined us a little bit late, we're visiting with James Garrett. We're talking about facing the future without fear. We're understanding the way fear works and our physical as well as our mental and emotional response to that. If you have questions for James, please don't hesitate to click on the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom window there and send us questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. We do have a question that came in, James, that's worth asking, because this is one I think might apply to a number of us. The question is, I have a friend who is prone to anxiety attacks. What is the best way that I can support her? So
Yeah,
I think we
great
all know
question.
people that struggle with this. Sometimes it is ourselves, but sometimes it's a loved one or a friend. So if someone has that tendency, is there anything that we can do as an outsider to help in that challenge that they're facing?
Yeah, so anxiety attacks are brought on by the anticipation of an overwhelming emotion. So there's like a you think of it like a runaway effect. So people are in let's assume they get nervous or they have a specific fear, sometimes what psychologists call phobia, around something like crossing bridges, high bridges in their car or something. So let's just say, hypothetically, they're coming up to this bridge and they start noticing their breath getting short. That's totally understandable. They have a conditioned response because they've gotten nervous or anxious about this thing in the past. So their brain is seeing that and then predicting that it's going to be bad, and therefore is activating all of those sort of elevation ramp up systems, those stress systems. Now, one of the most interesting things about anxiety attacks is people feel like, in serious ones, people feel like they may even die or they're having a heart attack, or the word is overwhelming. The people get overwhelmed by their inner sensations, their emotions. So one of the best ways to kind of create a foundation to help someone or help yourself around anxiety generally, but anxiety attacks specifically, is getting comfortable with uncomfortable emotions.
Okay.
And this is as humans, we want to do exactly the opposite. Our entire world is designed to make us comfortable. And businesses make a lot of money making us really comfortable,
Sure.
right? But the reality is growth from your brain's perspective, and certainly what activates or unlocks adult neuroplasticity, is actually a little bit of discomfort. So when it comes to activating neuroplasticity, it feels a little bit like mental effort. You have to focus as an adult. Like if you're reading, if it doesn't feel effortful, you're not actually going to retain the information. So there's a little bit of a cost, a little bit of an unpleasantness. It's not awful. It's fine, right? It's in the same way that exercise is a little bit uncomfortable. It's also enjoyable. It's both at the same time. But one of the things that something like getting better at understanding and feeling your own body, like something meditation or breathing would help you do, or yoga, or Tai Chi, or lots of different, yoga and meditation tend to be the two most known around these parts anyway. It'll help you notice when negative emotions come up and not actually resist them, or try to push them back down, to suppress them, or get rid of them, or run away from them, which naturally we want to do, understandably, because they're unpleasant. If somebody's angry at us, we want to avoid them. I know, because when my wife's angry at me, I want to avoid her. Like this
Of
is
course.
this is very clear to me, right? Um, if somebody's going to give us feedback on our new startup, it's like all vigilance lights go on, because it feels a little bit like this very uncomfortable situation, right? Elon Musk, for example, is very famous for asking for clear and direct negative feedback for how things can be improved. And it's one of his main strategies for how he thinks about what successful people do differently. They get good at dealing with discomfort. And so again, not I in some ways, what I'm saying applies generally to dealing with anxiety generally, and not but it would apply equally to someone managing anxiety attacks. Now, again, when you get specific into anxiety attacks, there are other tools and tips and strategies for how to manage that in the moment. A really lovely book is called "Don't Panic." That's a nice resource for this. Um, But there are ways to cut off that spiral, that kind of runaway effect. You cutting it off in while it's doing it, so that you can kind of calm the body back down.
Yeah, I like that. That makes sense. When we first started, we've got just a few minutes left here. I introduced you as someone who really immerses themselves into the research because you're experiencing it yourself, and you started this deep change project. I'm wondering if you will just share one experience that you had within this project, because you've tackled a number of different fears and anxieties that you've had. But I'm wondering if you can share one of the things, and you even took requests on some of these things throughout this project. Just share one story with us of a fear that you had and how you faced it.
Yeah. There were a lot, but one that's particularly meaningful and very active for me right now is, you know, I'm very passionate about the combination of psychology or brain science and technology. I think there's a lot of opportunity there right now, and I think there's a lot of meaningful ways I think we can improve humanity in merging these two usually separate spaces. And so I there's an app that I want to build that I think will solve the problem of behavior change. Now that's I know, a bold thing to say.
That's pretty ambitious.
Behavior change ends up being, I think, one of the hardest problems to crack. And given so I've been immersed in the science of behavior change, habit formation for years and years now. And I feel like I've finally figured out how to get the mechanisms to work in such a way that we can get ourselves to choose the harder thing each time, to get ourselves to go exercise each time, get ourselves to meditate each time, get ourselves to lean into that difficult emotion when our spouse is saying they're not so happy with us, getting us to whatever that thing is, getting us to have courage when we actually feel fear. How do we do the harder thing each time, which tends to be what habit formation is in the early days? So I decided that I'm going forward with it. So one of the things I actually did is I started renting some office space. It's still empty. This only happened like 3 weeks ago. Um, but it's still empty, but it will be filled with a couple programmers. And we're going to start designing this app together. I have one already who's working on the prototype. But that's a bit of a, I'm putting financial resources down. I'm sort of creating something without, and building it in the way entrepreneurs have to do, before it actually exists. It's still a vision I have of what I'm trying to build. And so facing everything that comes with it, fundraising, managing a team, like, just all of the unfun stuff, of entrepreneurship, but knowing that that's truly my goal and passion and vision. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. Is I've done a lot of other hacks, like driving through car washes backwards and random stuff, right? These are more like exercises. I think the rubber meets the road when it's really stuff you actually care about in your life.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. We've got one question here, and this will
Okay.
probably be our last question, but it is a good one, and I think it relates to everything that we've been talking about in a overview, big picture standpoint. The question is, I used to use journaling as a way to clear my head. Is this a good technique? What do you think about journaling?
Journaling's great. It's one of the things I'm actually working on a fair amount in my own life right now. Yeah, there's good scientific evidence to suggest that, when you write something, it's different than just speaking it. It forces you to process through things differently, and so, it, it does get it out of your head and onto paper. So think of it like this: brains hate open loops. So one of the reasons we worry or about things is actually we just have all these unclosed loops. I mean, this can be as benign or kind of everyday as something like what we're picking up from the grocery store, to I need to have a conversation with my dad about his health, or
Yeah,
any number of other things in between. But the more open loops you have, the more your brain starts spinning. It starts, worrying. because what it's trying to do is close all those loops. But if you just keep thinking about them instead of putting them into paper or into a task list, they're never going to close. Or more importantly, actually taking action on those, they're never going to close. So one of the best antidotes to anxiety is action. So if I'm feeling anxious, taking action actually stops the anxiety. So if there's one way to, so journaling from a brain level, think of it like this. When I get what's in my head onto paper or into a device, it takes it out of this system and puts it into a different system. When that happened, my brain treats it as though I did it. So if it's a to-do list item, your brain actually stops thinking about it as though you've already done it if it trusts that you'll come back to that to-do list. So that's like you get more bang for your buck if you just write it down. Anyway, but writing has these types of benefits to it, among others.
Awesome. Love it. How can we learn more, James? How can we learn more about what we're talking about?
I'll be launching. So I build courses in curricula and these types of things, but I'm launching a brand new behavior change and good habits masterclass and course. This will start on February 9th. This is taking everything I've learned from the last literally years of experience, testing myself as the guinea pig, all of it. You'll walk away from that experience being really masterful at changing, at behavior change and habit formation and making changes in your own life. So that starts February 9th. If you text the word habit to the number 44144, there's a 50% off discount code on the first month of that subscription. It's a 14-day free trial plus a 50% discount code that'll give you. That number I use for other things. So that 50% link, if you text that 44144, text the word habit, it'll be a different link in a little while. So I'd recommend, if you are interested in doing it relatively quickly, because I only have one number. So I circle it around, and I do so much speaking and presenting. I have to change it out quite often. So I'll type that in the chat box as well. It's 44144. That's text the word habit to 44144.
Okay, great. Thank you. 44144. Text the word habit. You'll have the opportunity to interact and learn from James on this topic of facing fear and so many other things. Well worth your time. I'm certain of that. James, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for taking time out of your day and sharing some of this expertise. We're really grateful. We appreciate it, and looking forward to additional interactions and things that we can learn from each other.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's webinar, then please tell your friends about it. The presentation will be available to rewatch. That will be at seniorgames.net. And all you have to do is click on the Living Your Best Life logo that you'll find once again at seniorgames.net. Be sure that you join us next month on Wednesday, February 24th. We'll be meeting with Paul Robbins, and we're going to talk a little bit about estate planning. We hope that you'll take just a second and participate in our 2-question survey, which will pop up on your screen once we log off. And until we meet again, we hope that you really are able to live your best life. Thank you, everyone.